Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, one of my favorite topics to do with scientists or with guests in general, but especially with scientists, is where you've changed your mind. And in the world of hypertrophy science and in the world of, your own experiences, I think people are going to be very interested from a muscle building perspective, like where you've changed your stance or changed your mind over the course of your career, really, not any specific timeline.
Yeah, quite a few topics. One that comes to mind right off the bat is nutrient timing. So I used to be a huge proponent. I bought hook, line, and sinker to the anabolic window of opportunity concept, which says that the post-workout period, like the first 45 minutes in the post-workout period, is critical to consuming nutrients, particularly protein and to some extent carbohydrate as well, to maximize the anabolic response. And if you go more than a few minutes outside of that window, you're going to be catabolic and compromise your gains. And the body of evidence just does not support that. When I really started getting into literature, my good friend and colleague Alan Aragon, which I know is a colleague of yours as well, opened my eyes to that. I remember speaking with him for like it was yesterday, circa 2013 or so, and he said, you really need to revisit that research because I don't think it shows what you think it does. And I did, and he was correct. And we ended up publishing review papers on this. We did meta-analyses. And I'll say this. So the theory was that if you miss out on this window, that you're catabolic, and that really you need, as soon as possible after your workout, you need to slam, 20 to 30 grams of protein and then double that amount of carbs. And that's going to not only replete your glycogen stores, but you're going to enhance muscle or optimize muscle protein synthesis. And first of all, even that from an acute standpoint, that's really not been well documented. But what's been shown is muscle is sensitized to protein for upwards of 24 hours after a workout. And as long as you're getting nutrients over time, what's by far and away the most important is the total daily intake of nutrients. And also what the research really did not look at is what happens if you have nutrients before your workout. So how many people resistance train fasted? I know some might, but most people don't. And it's been shown that if you're having the meal that you have pre-workout will influence the post-workout necessity to consume nutrients. So it's a more involved topic. And here's what I would say, that when I'm consulting with bodybuilders, I think that there's still maybe a small effect to consuming it relatively quickly after a workout. Again, somewhat predicated on your pre-workout, how quickly you did a pre-workout. But this is, again, cost benefit. It's not going to hurt you to take it in before earlier in your post-workout routine, and it potentially could be a downside to not doing so. But I think the actual benefit, all the research we have, it would be very modest benefit, but that could be practically meaningful to a bodybuilder. Yeah. For the average individual, I don't think it's going to make any noticeable difference, and you don't have to sweat about it. So I think that's an important one. Another one that's I've done pretty much a 180 on is this hypertrophy range of training that you need to be trained within 8 to 12, a repetition range of 8 to 12 reps. And there's been surveys with bodybuilders, the vast majority of them train in this somewhat mythical hypertrophy range. And there was various rationales for it, but the overwhelming body of evidence now shows that you can achieve hypertrophy across a very vast range of loading zones, anywhere from 5 reps up to 30 reps. And that gives us more freedom. Now, I do think the jury is still out. Could there be benefits to doing somewhat higher reps, including somewhat higher reps and somewhat lower reps? I think there is at least a basis for hypothesizing that. And we have some supporting evidence. It's, I think, relatively weak, but certainly no evidence that it's going to have negative effects. So I think the majority of your training can be in that hypertrophy zone just from an efficiency standpoint. But, and then you factor in some higher and lower rep training. But you also need to consider, I mean, if you have joint issues, you can train with higher reps have less stress on your joints and see very good gains without overstressing your joints.
I put a link down below for 30% off all things from Thrive Market on your first order. Now, they're not just about snacks and pantry staples. They've got good, legit, high protein foods, which is how I live. Even my snacks are high protein. Thing is, if you go to a grocery store, the high protein snacks, they're kind of playing games with you. Like they'll call it high protein, but you look at the ingredients and you realize that there's like some weird kind of like pea protein or something. Not that there's anything wrong with pea protein, but the reality is it's not what it seems on the surface. And it might only be 4 grams of protein. The thing I like about Thrive is you see what you get and you get what you see. It's transparent. So you can look at the ingredients and they're not gonna have garbage there and you're gonna be able to see it. And then it gets delivered right to your doorstep. So you're not having to spend time. Even myself, I know what to look for at a grocery store, but it takes me probably 25% longer to go grocery shopping than the average person because I do cross-reference everything that's in the ingredients. I don't like to bring that stuff into my house. Thrive Market takes that guesswork out of the equation for me, and it makes it accessible to me, but it makes it accessible to people all over the country. So that's what's really cool. So that link gets you 30% off your entire first grocery order and gets you a free $60 gift. Not to mention it gets delivered right to your doorstep, which is pretty darn cool, and their shipping is speedy, speedy fast. So that link down below.
What's your, within that, what's your take on BFR training? Just kind of curious because you mentioned, stress on the joints. I know a lot of people have success with it. I kind of enjoy it. It's not a staple. I guess it is kind of a staple for me, but I don't rely on it. What's your take?
It can be very effective. The the limitation of BFR is that it really is only effective in the muscles that are distal to the occlusion. So let's say you're going to occlude in your, if you want to train your biceps, you have to tie off right in your deltoid area, and then you'll get the distal effect. But thus, it's almost impossible really to get much effect in your pecs. You can't, there's nowhere to tie off.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a way that instead of using, you can use light loads and not need to train with as many repetitions. So you can reduce the amount of repetitions needed. And there's additional discomfort for anyone who's trained with very high reps with light loads knows that the acidosis can be very overwhelming. And that's a way that you can reduce the number of reps needed to be close to failure.
Is there, we're going to go down, I want to get back to other things you've changed your mind on, but just getting out a little bit of like a bit of a rabbit hole with this, because you look at BFR and sort of this swelling that can occur and possibly even perhaps even stretching of the fascia, right? Kind of comes back to if you go like real hardcore bodybuilders and synthol use, right? They claim that stretches it out so that they can accommodate more growth. Is there any evidence to support that like BFR by causing this sort of extreme, because there's this pretty legit pump that comes with it, right? Pretty serious where it's stretching things out a lot. Can that allow for more growth, or is that really myth?
Well, we don't have any evidence that that's the case. The theory behind it's the cell swelling theory, that it has, there is a basis for it on molecular research. So some test tube research showing that it has anabolic effects on muscle protein synthesis, on various anabolic pathways. In vivo and in the living, it's very difficult to study. One of the things that BFR has been shown to potentially have beneficial effects on is type 1 fiber growth. So there is, we actually published a review on this, and there's somewhat conflicting evidence, but I think that there's enough positive evidence on it that makes me I think it's somewhat promising in this regard, that it may enhance the hypertrophic response if you may add in some BFR training to target the type 1 fibers. Thus, you can target overall hypertrophy. And I'd say more studies than not seem to show a mild to moderate benefit in that regard.
So just out of curiosity though, what was the potential mechanistic reason there for the type 1 muscle growth?
Yeah, so understanding mechanisms is problematic and very difficult to pin down, but hypothetically, and I think I can speculate, that it could be that the higher repetitions that are used in this training keep the type 1 fibers under load, under a higher tension for longer periods of time, and that type 1 fibers are more endurance oriented. At least conceivably, it could be related to the effect of keeping them under a stimuli that would be more conducive to their
growth. That makes sense. And maybe when you consider that perhaps people that are using them aren't necessarily always training from an endurance perspective, and then maybe it's very novel for them, right? It's like putting them into a forced situation to train in that capacity. Well, what else have you changed your mind on?
Yeah, so another topic is the hormone hypothesis. So there was this theory back when I was an up-and-coming exercise science student that if you train in a manner where you have short rest periods with multi-joint exercises for multiple sets, that will jack up or elevate your post-exercise hormonal response of testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1, which have been shown to be involved in hypertrophy. But they're transient spikes. So you would see this spike in these hormones for about an hour after the bout of exercise, and then they would go back to normal. But it was thought that this hormonal spike kickstarted the muscle growth process. And this had been a popular theory, and it was shown there was an association, a correlation with muscle growth, with the anabolic response. And as we all know, correlation is not necessarily causation. And the emerging literature over time has, I don't want to necessarily say debunked that, but I think it has really cast doubt that it has any substantial effect. Might it have a small effect? I don't think we can really say at this point, but I certainly would say that should not be the basis for arranging your programming. You shouldn't try to program around to maximize the anabolic hormonal response. And that, again, when I was an up-and-coming sports scientist, that was an emerging theory.
What about the lower body kind of squat and leg press for testosterone increase? Is that negligible?
Yeah, again, that would be the hormonal response, the hormone hypothesis. And by the way, interestingly, part of that hormone hypothesis was predicated on these short rest periods, so like a minute or less of rest between sets. And the emerging literature there shows that very short rest periods seem to compromise hypertrophy, conceivably because you're not being able to get the number of repetitions on your successive sets, and thus your volume load is going down, and your the mechanical tension of each set is going to be somewhat compromised. So you need to do more sets to make up for the sets, the volume load that was lost.
How much of a role, independent of exogenous testosterone use, does testosterone really play a role, or is it much more about your androgen receptor density? Should young men or middle-aged men that are within a healthy testosterone range, should they really even be fixated on it, or is it kind of a waste of time unless they're dismally low or using exogenous?
Yes, interesting question. And look, trying to study these topics is difficulties because of from an ethical standpoint. Yeah. So look, clearly steroids work, and there is a dose-response relationship. As you continue to get take more and more steroids, you're going to get bigger and bigger. If you're hypogonadal, meaning that your testosterone is out of the normal, quote unquote, normal range for men. So, and this is for men in particular, because that is the male-dominated hormone, testosterone. Women, it would be estrogen. If you're hypogonadal, there's going to be compromising of your gains. There's less evidence that, let's say you're within that quote unquote normal range, how much difference, if any, it makes. So there's somewhat different guidelines as to what is considered normal, but usually it's somewhere around 300 to 800 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone, chronic circulating testosterone levels. If you're within, let's say, 400 to 600 nanograms per deciliter, that's a 1/3 difference. Certainly we don't have any good evidence that that's going to make a big difference in your muscle building capacity, even though on a percentage basis, that would be substantially higher. Now, if you're at the very low end of that range, let's say if you're at 350 versus at the high range, 800. By the way, sometimes the range goes up to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. Could there be? I think there's some evidence that there may be differences there. When you start getting above that normal range, that's where you certainly start to see muscle building benefits enhanced substantially.
Yeah. I mean, any like super physiological level. I mean, I think there's probably this peak where it becomes a little bit like the more super physiological you are, the more super physiological your gains are, right? So that would make sense that once you get out of that normal range, it's like the body maybe has this kind of barometer where it's like this is abnormal, right?
But to your point, the androgen receptor effects are going to be very important in this regard as well. Now, there's some theoretically, when you increase testosterone, you will necessarily also increase the susceptibility of the androgen receptors to taking up the testosterone. Again, not really well studied. There is, I think, better evidence that the acute androgen receptor response has a greater effect on your muscular gains than the acute hormonal response. Yeah. Could there be some interrelationships? Maybe, but we're just not sure of how you can alter that through training. I'm not aware of any evidence that can be altered.
Is it true that, I mean, we have more androgen receptors in the upper body? So, I mean, when people are more receptive, I mean, is it essentially easier to grow your upper body from a hormonal perspective? Like if you were even using exogenous testosterone, or hypothetically, I guess, even if your just testosterone was naturally very high, you have more density in the upper body, so you build more there?
So we don't have certainly good research that's looked at different levels of testosterone and how that might alter upper versus lower body response. I mean, there is some evidence that you do need more volume for the lower body, but some of that's conflicting as well. So,
and that kind of makes fundamental sense too. I mean, the lower body's probably designed to be taking on more endurance just Correct. In general. So
you're using your lower body more throughout the day for ambulation, obviously, than you are doing things with upper body.
I guess, and not to go too far off in a different direction, but since we're talking upper lower, does the lower body tend to respond better with higher reps than the upper body? Do you see any difference there in terms of how they respond with rep ranges?
No. So the majority of muscles in the body have somewhat of an even or 40, somewhere within 40 to 60% fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. Conceivably, training a muscle that is more slow twitch with higher reps would make sense versus and training muscles that would be more fast switch oriented with lower reps. Even that has not been shown to actually pan out in practice. So we carried out a study that looked at the calf muscles, and we tried to target the soleus. We hypothesized that targeting the soleus with higher reps, 20 to 30 reps, would give it greater growth than 8 to 12 reps. That did not pan out. There was roughly very similar growth between on a whole cohort level. There was some inter-individual differences, but who knows what to make of that.
What about, I think there was, there's been studies over the years, but I think there was something that was within the last year or something that's training lower body does elicit a bit of growth in the upper body. Is that explained by anything, or is that just such negligible stuff that it's really not worth focusing on?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any good research that's shown that. I mean, look, if you're doing squats and you're not training your upper body, you're probably going to get some growth just because, I mean, you're stabilizing through your upper body, and there's going to be some muscular involvement where if you're sedentary, you got nothing. But I don't think
I think most of these studies are looking at untrained individuals too. So when they're looking at like, okay, you're taking an untrained or very minimally trained person and you're putting them under a bar and they're having to simply even isometrically contract just the hold, right? They're probably going to have some degree of growth. Yeah, it's definitely nothing in an elite level. And that's why I asked the question, because it's never seemed to me that unless you're doing something like a deadlift, which is absolutely lower and upper, then it's, or, I suppose when you're in a squat, if you're really training at a high enough intensity, there's some pretty significant isometric contraction, but not enough to say like, I gained an inch on my biceps from doing squats.
Yeah, that certainly doesn't happen. And by the way, if you were to do a leg press, I would speculate you're going to get very little upper body.
That's a good point. Unless you're like gripping the sides like crazy. But even then, which, we'll do a separate topic because I'm curious about isometric contraction in the first place. But anything else you've changed your mind on?
Yeah, another thing is the concept that you need to train to failure to optimize gains. And I was raised on the go all out or go home philosophy where every set needed to be taken to failure, and then you needed to use intensification. I would use forced reps was staples in my routine. I'd train with a partner, and we'd get every rep. All right, give me another. And the emerging body of literature shows that really is not the case. Now, so you're going to need to train really hard. So certainly I'm not, I think it's very important to understand you can't just lift weights and then be 5 or 6 reps away from failure and expect to get really good gains. Now, if you're untrained, you can.
Yeah.
But as you get more and more well-trained, you're going to be in relative close proximity to failure. And that's probably somewhere around a 2, maybe 3 RIR, repetitions in reserve, meaning that you could have gotten 2 or 3 more reps before you failed. And we're getting really a fairly compelling body of literature showing that there's very similar growth. Now, look, there's limitations to this research. So all the studies have looked at either all sets to failure versus no sets to failure. What if you just did the last set to failure? It doesn't have to be a binary choice. They weren't in elite lifters. So we have some that have been in trained individuals, not many. Could it be as you get closer to your genetic ceiling that there may be some benefit, at least on some sets, to taking it closer to failure? What about doing single joint exercises versus multi-joint exercises? You're not going to be taxing your body as much. So doing, let's say, a lateral raise to failure will not be tapping into your fatigue as much as doing a squat to failure. So how might that change things? So there's a lot that we don't have answers to, but I think overall, the majority I think we have pretty good evidence now that at least the majority of training should be or can be somewhat short of failure, and you'll still get good gains. Now, with that said, I think it's very important to point out that you need to train to failure early on in your career to understand how far away you are from failure from an RIR standpoint. So if you've never trained to failure, you're not going to be able to really gauge your proximity to failure well. And that's problematic. So I think that some training to failure is mandatory, at least to be able to allow you to properly gauge your proximity.
You said something that's so basic, but it just makes so much sense that training to failure in isolation movements where you're safe, right? Where you're safer. I think there's even psychologically and probably, neurologically, like there's a safety element there. It's you take maybe a very advanced lifter might be a little bit different, but even a recreational lifter, to have them go to failure with a bar on their back, like there's just an inherent risk there. And there's an inherent concern of like, am I safe in this position? And you're going all the way to, there's multiple points of failure that you could have, right? It could be just muscular failure. You could, start to tense up your QL in your back. And, you just all these different places where you might fail, but not actually true muscle failure, right? Or flat out just mental exhaustion and or getting gassed out. So it's like the true ability to go to that true failure in a squat is probably significantly harder than to go to true failure in an isolated preacher curl or something. So it's like, what is failure? Define failure, right? It's like where are they failing on a squat? Are they cardiovascularly fit enough to truly fail in a squat? So it's that's a really good point, because I've always kind of trained with like the big compound movements, almost always with 1 to 2 reps in reserve, because it felt from a safety perspective as like an athlete, it's reduced my risk of injury. But then when I would go over to, leg extensions, or I'd go over to hamstring curls or something where I'm in a safe, controlled, possibly even machine environment, I would go all the way and just reduce my risk of injury. But I felt like I was getting good growth out of it.
Yeah, I think the safety factor there is quite important, that particularly you know your limitations, and that I think a lot of lifters, resistance training is one of the safest activities you can do, assuming you understand your limitations and you don't try to ego lift or push it beyond what you can do.
Yeah. I think there's probably a good number of people watching or listening that have, experienced the, deadlifting to failure and the risks involved in that. And I think there's a body types that come into play too. I think you also have to understand, we talked about this in another episode, but even your own anthropometrics, your own build, like what lifts put you at more risk, right? It's, Like I have a short tib fib and a long, femur, right? So it when I'm squatting to failure, I do kind of put myself at risk with this long lever arm, right? So it's like elevate the heels, do these things to kind of, and
compensate.
I used to think that there was shame in that, right? Like you're not growing up as a bodybuilder too. It's like I'm looking at the stuff. I'm like, okay, what's Ronnie doing, or what's Victor Martinez doing, and like all these. And it's like, okay, if I'm not doing it like that, then I'm not going to get the same growth. And the science is just demonstrated through and through that's just not the case. Like it's okay to adapt and to modify how you have to modify, right?
Agreed.
So, anything else you've changed your mind on?
Yeah, I mean, to some lesser extents, I think that I grew up believing a split routine was the best way to train because of the pump. Primarily, that's how you get your best pump. And my group published a study that actually showed greater growth in a total body routine than a split routine. Now, there were limitations to that study for drawing causality in terms of whether a split is better than a total body routine. But I would say that the evidence that we have does not show any inherent advantage to a split. I think there's reasons you can do a split that makes it more effective when you're doing higher volumes in particular to get sufficient volume in over the course of a week. I think that's where splits can be more effective. But I had thought that there was some inherent advantage, particularly from a pump standpoint, and we've not seen that to be the case.
Yeah. I've recently become much more of a full body fan myself. I feel like I'm less, there's less soreness, cumulative total load over the course of the week. I feel like I can actually do more volume that way. I'm not obliterating a body part and then, sore. Don't feel like I can, use it for 3 or 4 days. It almost a lot of times makes a lot of sense for me. Do you think there's merit to just kind of rotating up how you do your splits anyway?
Yeah, look, I think novelty is could be a potentially beneficial factor. So I think changing around your routine to various extents can be beneficial. I think you got to be careful not to do it, to overdo that. I think there's a somewhat of a delicate balance there.
How so? Just because like neurologically you want to kind of develop patterns too?
Well, correct. I mean, let's say you're changing your exercises every session, and particularly when you're using more complex movements, let's say like a squat. If you do a squat today and then don't do it again for 3 months, you're not going to be able to squat pretty well. So, and also it allows you, I think having certain consistencies allows you to gauge whether your performance is decreasing. So having at least some movements that are consistent within your routine, the way you gauge overtraining or at least non-functional overreaching is if you start to see negative effects in your performance. Mm-hmm. And if you're consistently switching around things, it becomes more difficult.
What about that's a great lead into a question about, beginning your workout with the compound movements. Does that really matter anymore? Does it, yeah?
No, I don't think that does any benefit. I think, I assume you're talking about for increasing the testosterone level?
Oh, no. Even just from my hypertrophy standpoint, like it's leg day. Do you have to start with squats? It's like always, or is obviously, I guess you could, fatigue yourself and make it so you're not going to squat as much, but does it, and I know you've done some work on pre-exhaust, which would be interesting. We could talk about it here too. I know we'll do another topic on that too, but it just seemed like a good place to mention that because it's like always, I don't know. Some days I like to squat first. Some days I actually like to do some other stuff first and squat, maybe not last, but in the middle of my workout.
So from a hypertrophy perspective, it's not going to matter.
Okay.
Or when I say it's not going to matter, we don't have good evidence that is the case. From a movement standpoint, it does. Now, if you're going to do squats after a leg extension, you're not going to be able to use the same loads you normally would. If your goal is to maximize your squatting capacity, then you're going to want to put that first. So that's the specificity principle. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, we don't have good evidence of that.
So is there potential benefit to pre-exhausting first, like maybe doing a leg extension and then jumping into squats?
So we just carried out a study, a shout out to my student, Tommy Herman, who led this study as part of his master's thesis. And we looked at we looked at pre-exhaust supersets, which is generally that's the way Arthur Jones originally proposed it. So you do a single joint move immediately followed by a compound exercise. So we did, let's say, a leg extension immediately followed by a squat. And the idea is that if you pre-exhaust the quads in the squat, it's going to fail before your lower back is going to give out in the squat.
Yeah.
It did not produce the desired effect. And we also looked, by the way, at a hamstring exercise, same type of principle, where we did a leg curl immediately followed by a RDL, Romanian deadlift. And again, with the lower back as a limiting factor, conceivably you'd pre-fatigue the target muscle, and that would allow you to get greater inroading into that muscle. Not only didn't it show benefits, there was a slight negative effect on hypertrophy. Conceivably, the volume load that they were able to do was much less, and that would lend itself again to mechanical tension as the primary driver of hypertrophy. If you're not keeping the same mechanical tension at a given number of sets, you're going to, at least theoretically, reduce your hypertrophic potential. And this did give some confirmatory evidence of that. It wasn't much, it wasn't a big difference, but it was a relatively modest effect. But every muscle group that we looked at showed some negative, slightly negative effects.
So do you feel like just tracking your total amount of load moved in a given workout probably just makes sense in that case? I mean, it's almost like it all kind of becomes relative to that load in some ways. Like if you're pre-exhausting, but you're not able to do as much load on the, your bigger movements, then, are you netting out with less load over the course of the workout?
I think it can give you a decent gauge, provided that that you're keeping constant the number of sets.
Okay.
And the repetition range. So if you're doing, let's say you shift to a higher rep range, you can't equate doing 15 to 20 reps versus doing 8 to 10 reps in that respect. It confounds the ability to use a volume load as a variable in that respect. But yeah, I think that can give you just a general gauge as to the effects of your mechanical tension and thus your muscle building capacity.
Yeah, no, that's helpful to know, because I think that sometimes it's like it's all or nothing sort of thought pattern on it. Like, okay, I need to look at my total load moved, and I think they would combine different rep ranges of sets in that. But that makes sense. Like you kind of have to be along that same axis in a way.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. What else? Anything else you've pivoted on?
Yeah. So I also grew up in that bodybuilding mentality of eating 6 meals a day with evenly spaced protein portions, that you didn't want to go over 30 grams or so of protein, that because you'd waste, the protein would be wasted. You're not going to use it for muscle building. So I would eat 6 meals regimented every 2 or 3 hours. And the body of evidence shows that you do not oxidize once you get above 30 grams or so of protein. It's not oxidized. You can utilize more protein so there's no preconceived number of grams that everyone can only adhere to. There's going to be an upper limit at some point, certainly. A recent study actually showed that. Now, they only looked at 100 grams versus 20 or 25, I don't recall.
25, I think. Yeah.
And showed that the 100 grams continued to have beneficial effects on muscle protein synthesis over a much longer period of time. But they didn't look at 100 versus 50, so that gives some limitations in drawing conclusions. But
they also didn't wish they would have looked at whey in isolation too, as something that was a little bit more insulinogenic and faster absorbing. Because I think it was a great study, one of my favorite studies probably of all time. Like I love that, and so well done. But a lot of it kind of comes down to, okay, well, they're using casein and they're using all these things that do also have slower digestibility. So is it just, rather than having this truncated absorption, are you just drawing it out? Which either way, it still is very liberating to know that we could just have 100 grams of protein. I think the title even said no upper limit, which is a bit exaggerated, but it's, do you think it would have been different if it was whey, or do you think it would have been the same?
So I don't find that question all that interesting, because it really doesn't look at what's ecologically valid. Who's just going to eat 100 grams of protein versus 25 grams and then not eat the rest of the day? Like, to me, the more relevant topic is within your normal eating patterns, what's necessary. And to your point, not even that. So first of all, if you're going to have shakes, I guess, then that could be relevant. Yeah. And I certainly did use that in my diet. But when you're talking about normal meals, so eating chicken and rice, or steak and potatoes. That's going to slow digestion in itself, that your digestibility of these foods is going to slow the entry of these amino acids into circulation. And that's going to have an even greater effect on reducing that, the potential oxidation effects of these amino acids, because they're going to you're going to have a much slower entry into the system. So even with, let's say, looking at whey, you're just going to have a whey shake, or you're going to have it in a smoothie with some blueberries, and that is going to have some fiber in it. And anyway, these are all things that I think the evidence now points to. As long as you're having 3, certainly 4 meals a day, it just doesn't make a difference of relatively evenly spaced protein doses. And that, to me, I think if you're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner in particular, certainly for the average individual, for the recreational lifter, intermediate lifter, not going to make much, if any, difference. For a bodybuilder, might there be that 4th meal getting in, and maybe a pre-bedtime shake? Could that?
Yeah.
I think the jury is still out. We don't have good evidence that it is the case. Could again, no real downside to it. Could it maybe have a small upside? I think when I'm advising bodybuilders, hey, go for it, as long as it's not going to interfere with your sleep or whatever.
Stan Efferding, I remember, he's like, yeah, well, he's like, I have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a protein shake on my nightstand, and when I get up to pee at 1 a.m, I eat, which maybe that actually has more merit than actually trying to cram 4 into a 12-hour period. Maybe like, okay, who knows? Like, wake up in the middle of the night and eat. I mean, when you're a brick house like Stan is, maybe that works, right?
Well, look, to some of the time-restrictive feeding studies that have been done, that have looked at muscle hypertrophy. Now, we don't have a lot of data on this, but there's been 8-16, so 8 hours of eating and then 16 hours fasting. There's really not much difference in the very similar results generally in terms of the hypertrophy. So again, I just don't think that's something, as much as I was micromanaging my eating, and it's liberating to be able just to not every few hours, I got to get my nutrition in.
No, I think it is extremely liberating. It's like, okay, the stimulus is the most important thing, closely followed by protein, then calories, then probably carbohydrate load. It's just like that hierarchy it is a liberating hierarchy. I think there's been, some evidence. I don't know where you stand on this. I mean, obviously the timing of protein after a workout doesn't seem to matter much at all. The timing of carbohydrates after a workout doesn't seem to matter, but it seems to matter more than protein if restoring glycogen is your goal.
That is correct. So the only time that really matters is if you're doing like 2-a-days.
Okay.
So let's say you're an endurance athlete or even an anaerobic athlete that's doing, so let's say a soccer player. I don't know when soccer players ever have 2 matches in a day. Maybe you're practicing in the morning and then playing in the evening. Or conceivably, if you're doing the double splits that Schwarzenegger used to do, I think that could be relevant there. You do see a massive reduction in glycogen repletion. So it's like 50% reduction if you outside of a 2-hour or so window. But here's the thing, as long as you're consuming the same amount of carbs within a day, by the following day, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
So if you're just doing a single workout in a day and then you're not doing another one until the following day, which is most people, then it's not going to matter. But if there's a reason where you're doing 2-a-days, then it could have relevance.
Or I suppose if you're even a lower carb athlete that's just trying to consolidate carbohydrates to a specific time of the day, like you're going to be granted probably the most amnesty to have those carbs post-workout. The backloading still does apply with carbohydrates, it seems.
Correct.
That's kind of nice. I mean, because like I spent a number of, almost 10 years on a ketogenic diet, and I would still carb backload, and that was my strategy. It would work. That was the one time I would allow myself to have carbs. And now there's the insulin independent glucose uptake intra workout, which I find particularly fascinating for me, but which actually is a question. I don't know if this has even been studied, but is there any evidence to intra workout carbohydrates at all? Or is that like just
no? So
whatever floats your boat?
Interesting you bring that up. So my good friend, may rest in peace, John Meadows, was a huge fan of intra-workout carb supplementation. He swore that in his athletes that it really made a big difference, and he kept prodding me to investigate it. We haven't gotten around to it, but it's a topic that has not been studied. I'm just skeptical of I think to me the theoretical underpinnings are questionable. I just don't think they have a strong rationale. So which makes, if something doesn't have a strong rationale to it, I am somewhat hesitant to spend resources studying it. But look, I have nothing but the absolute respect for John. He's a dear friend and unfortunately passed away too soon. Again, he was as good a bodybuilder, not only as good a bodybuilder as there is, but as astute a bodybuilder. He was someone, I helped mentor him in many ways. He would contact me about it, always asking about research on topics, really tried to take an evidence-based approach. One of the most evidence-based lifters that I have known. And when he says something, I take notice. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, like my silo, so to speak, has been in a low carb world, which I don't want to say operates autonomously, but there's slightly different metabolomics and things that go on there. And it's, so for me, it was like, okay, intra-workout carbohydrates were a time where I could have some carbohydrates with minimal insulin spike, right? Because I was able to. So for me, it was just more about, hey, this is the time that I could have my carbohydrates with the least potential negative impact based upon what I was doing. I certainly can't say that I got any additional growth from it or anything. It was just, and come to find out later on in the low carb world that, you're creating glycogen from other stores anyway, the gluconeogenesis. So it was kind of like a moot point. In fact, could have even been inhibiting that by actually providing carbohydrates and potentially preventing and stalling that gluconeogenesis so it was like, but still to this day, there's something for me to having like watermelon juice intra-workout. Like maybe it's the citrulline, maybe it's something that's like, I feel like, okay, there's this blood volumization. It does feel good. But again, I can't say that it's caused any more muscle growth. Yeah. All right. What else have you changed your mind on?
Yeah, another topic would be that if full range of motion is always optimal for muscle building. And again, we now have emerging evidence that partial training, assuming it is in the lengthened position. So we have very good evidence that full range of motion training is better than shortened range of motion training. So if I were to do, let's say, a curl from here to its to end range, that would have would impair the hypertrophic response compared to doing from start to finish. But if you're just doing the initial range of training, the evidence seems to show that it's at least as good as doing full range of training, assuming you're training with similar levels of effort. Basically what the evidence is leaning to, and I think it's quite interesting, is that the anabolic portion of a lift is the stretched position. Now, I want to say this with the caveat, this is on a limited number of muscle groups that we have and exercises that we have the evidence. It's starting to evolve. But I know my good buddy Brett Contreras, he still thinks that for the glutes, they may work better in the shortened position. We don't have good evidence one way or the other to either confirm or refute that. So I think this needs more investigation across muscle groups, but certainly for the arms and the legs, the calves, quads, I think we now have good enough evidence where we can say that certainly the initial position, the starting to mid position, is more hypertrophically important than the shortened position. Now, that is from hypertrophy. From a strength standpoint, it is not the case. No. And there is definitely angular specificity to training, and that you tend to get strength in the angles that are trained. So if you're only training in the lengthened position, the strength gains are going to be most specific to that position. Our group recently carried out a study that demonstrated that quite well, and there's been other research that's supported that.
What about, I use like bicep curl, like barbell 21s as an example, right? When you're like doing a full range, a bottom range, and a top range. Does the order of that potentially matter? Has that even been looked at?
No, but I would say that to your point there, I would question the need to do the shortened position portion of the 21s.
Altogether, yeah.
And whether, I'm not even sure that 21s are even relevant even for the full and the, so the full and the lengthened position. Here's what's, I think, somewhat more interesting. And again, my good friend John Meadows had speculated that doing static holds in the lengthened position when you've gotten to failure as a post-failure strategy can help to enhance hypertrophy. And there's been some evidence that actually has shown that may be the case, that might augment the hypertrophic response. Again, limited evidence. I don't have a strong opinion on it, but I think it's quite interesting, the potential for it. And I think that to me would be more the way that you might want to use it than in a 21.
Yeah. It's, someone like John, it's like you look at these bodybuilders, like for lack of a better term, no pun intended, like the sheer number of reps that they have of just self-experimentation. There's so many different theories that float around because like maybe they are just the N of one that's been able to really find what works best for them. And the most elite bodybuilders in the world are the ones that they've either hit the jackpot with luck and kind of finding what works for them, or they have so many reps and just practice of finding what works for them that it can almost just be this massive crapshoot of what works and what doesn't, because they're the one anomaly in the world probably that has so much experience with themselves in isolation that they're like, I promise you this works. This works, this stretch works. And maybe it does for them, but maybe it's not able to be replicated.
Yeah, look, that's always going to be the case. If you look at the top bodybuilders, there's going to be a very wide range of training styles that they use. And particularly when you're talking IFBB pros, there's of course the gear factor that there's always a genetic factor, and then you can't account for the quote unquote special supplements that are used.
Yeah.
So I think people ask me, what is the biggest mistake that you made? And it was going back to my early days of bodybuilding, following the routines of bodybuilders and expecting that was going to be key to getting growth. I remember, I'm sure you do as well, in the early days of the magazines, or I shouldn't say but when we still had magazines that were delivered to your house, I would go out to my mailbox. I had subscriptions. I'd rip open the plastic wrapping and I'd look at hey, what did my favorite bodybuilder do for his legs? And I'll use that for my leg routine this month. And I certainly got some results at the beginning, but I plateaued very rapidly.
Yeah.
And obviously realized that, as you just said, they were unique cases and they had other things going for them. Certainly I didn't. So.
I mean, that was one of my favorite things to do too. There was a novelty to it, but then it's to your earlier point. It's like when you have your new subscription of Flex magazine coming every month, and that means every month you're changing your programming. Because you're like, oh, this is what Flex Lewis is doing. Oh, this is what Victor Martinez is. I'm going to do this. You're never actually developing a true periodization.
Routine, yep.
Yeah. Anything else you've changed your mind on?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a good scale of it. I'd have to think more. I generally thought that training muscle twice a week was superior than training it once a week. We touched on this in an earlier segment, but I think that now has been shown it's more volume dependent, that if you're doing somewhat low to moderate volume training, that one time a week is sufficient, where the multiple times per week seems to become more increasingly important is when you're doing more than 10 or so sets in a given session.
Yeah.
That's splitting that up over multiple sessions. And why it perhaps might be due to the protein synthesis response, that you're only able to tap out a certain amount, or that you tap out your muscle protein synthetic response at a certain number of sets. Could that somewhat be inter-individual as well? We don't know, but I think certainly as you're getting into somewhat higher volumes, it makes more sense at 20 sets per muscle, for a muscle per week. It's better to do Monday 10 and Thursday 10 than it is your bro split of 20 sets in a given workout.
True. This next one's a fun one that I like to do with people of your caliber. It's like if you had unlimited funding, unlimited access to whatever cohort you wanted, like just sky's the limit. What's your dream study that you would craft?
So yeah, I'd want to take a cohort of trained natural bodybuilders to an island where we can feed them regimented amounts of food and really micromanage their eating, their, as much as possible, their sleeping, control their stress, and then just study the different variables, study manipulation of different variables over a period of time. Now, if and when you're ready to fund that study, you let me know, because I'm ready to go. But unfortunately, I think it'll be a while before that becomes a reality.
Yeah, and ethically probably wouldn't be possible. But yeah, it'd be fun to have another island of enhanced athletes, like do natural athletes versus enhanced athletes, and kind of see just all the different variables that would change. I mean,
the problem with enhanced athletes, it's how do you standardize the special supplements that they're taking? Like that is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, if you will, that, people take different dosages. And by the way, I don't know how much of a rabbit hole you want to go through here, but I've speculated that we know there's different people respond differently based on genetics, but I speculate that there might be steroid responders as well. That's people respond differently. Anecdotally, I've heard that is the case. So different people take the same amounts of steroids, and one person blows up on it and the other person doesn't.
Yeah, and androgenic responders versus more anabolic responders. There's people that just swear by, the androgenic compounds, and they're just don't respond all that much to more testosterone and things like that. So that's a different topic for another day, but it's definitely, it fascinates me, since we're starting to get into a world where I say it, unfortunately, a lot of younger people are just, experimenting balls to the wall, probably, in my opinion, way too early, but it's becoming a thing, and it probably needs to be addressed, and looked at. But that's always been curious about that as well, because you have some people that need multiple grams of gear and get arguably the same effect as people that are using very minimal amounts. Right. And compare that to the Arnold Schwarzenegger era, and which I don't know. Different topic for a different day. But Brad, where can everyone find you, man?
Just Google me.
Oh, I love that. It's the best. Thanks, Brad.
You're welcome, man.